We're going to be discussing corporate versus individual liability. This is from Module 2, Reading, Part 1. The early doctrine on corporate criminal liability really started at the federal level with New York Central and Hudson River Railroad versus U.S. in 1909, which is where the Supreme Court affirmed the idea that a corporation, not just individual executives, could be held liable for crime involving intent, that essentially a collection of individuals embodied in a corporation could be held legally liable. This was based on the sense of the need for more measures to control powerful business interests, that you needed some way to rein in the increasingly concentrated corporate power in the U.S. Criminal penalties were seen as more likely to deter future offenses. Fast forward to what the readings describe as the Pinto cases by Ford Motor Company. But these really showed the challenge of having corporate liability. The facts via Gase: Pinto had rushed design, created a misplaced gas tank on their new small cars, which tended to blow up in collisions, catching on fire, despite Ford actually owning a patent for a much safer gas tank that they decided was too expensive to deploy. Ford, in fact, lobbied against government standards that would have forced it to change the gas tank. The result? 500 burn deaths caused by these Pinto crashes. Now, Ford itself had done 40 crash tests, and top executives were fully informed of how unsafe the cars were. Yet, when Indiana prosecutors actually brought criminal charges against some of the executives in 1978, they couldn't get the conviction because many of the jurors bought into the idea that accidents happen, that there wasn't a way to hold a corporation collectively responsible. And this is the question that's raised. Does criminal law make sense applied to a fictional entity like a corporation? Our whole multi-thousand history of criminal law was developed with flesh and blood humans in mind. Can a corporation have what legally is called the mens rea, the wrongful state of mind, for a criminal act? The reality is many believe only individual agents should be subject to criminal sanction. But in your reading by Gobert describes an alternative view on corporate criminal liability. The idea is, since people combine efforts and personnel changes constantly within a corporation, you need tools to hold a corporation collectively responsible. Deliberate harm may require individual intent, but if there's systematic failure to take preventive action, then if a collective harm happens, then that is a failure that you can hold a corporation collectively responsible for. The quote he gives: employees are also well aware that the refusal to carry out the orders of a superior can lead to a reprimand and even dismissal. To pin legal responsibility for resulting criminal harm on any ordinary worker in this position would be nothing more than an excuse and scapegoating. This is the problem. If you hold the individuals responsible, they can claim they were just taking orders. But then you have the problem of, if the orders are made in a diffuse manner in a corporation, essentially nobody can be held responsible. Yes, if there's some specific overt act of violence, that can be charged to an individual. But failure to create a protective environment across a corporation really needs to be attributed to the company as a whole. So, how do you approach harm that's the product of multiple individual acts? You look at the cumulative effect of less than ideal acts that can lead to something more than mere negligence. The readings cite to the death of 200 in a boat capsizing, where no criminal liability was found because no one person could be identified as guilty. But there's, in many cases, almost a probabilistic model of almost certainty that small irresponsible acts can lead to disaster in many cases. There was also the Bank of America case, where multiple people having parts of knowledge to identify fraud creates collective knowledge of fraud. So how do you put that together when there should be a responsibility to aggregate that information and know that fraud is happening? That aggregation of responsibility creates a far better model for corporate liability. So what is the basis for holding a company liable for collective results of these agents' acts? Well, think about it. The company hires and trains the staff. The company provides those potential offenders with the means to commit the offense in the first place. You often have a promotion reward structure that encourages illegal behavior in order to get promoted. And if the supervisors are looking the other way, that's a failure of the supervisory systems. And the corporate culture, by validating, extreme profit taking, things that are almost unrealistic without certain kinds of fraud, that creates a rationalization, a cultural reason why individuals will push the envelope. This is why many wrongdoers, when caught in a corporate crime, will cite to the corporate norms, the corporate culture that encourage them. The bottom line, companies are under a legal duty not only to establish a law-compliant culture, one that officially is checking the boxes of the law, but to put in place systems that will prevent the criminal offenses by their whole range of personnel. Maurice Punch argues for a focus on what he calls organizational deviance. A lot of the focus is on deviant executives, but he wants to argue for looking at the whole set of organizational components of crime. You can often have very legitimate organizational goals, but then the way they're framed, the way the corporate culture is built, you end up with organizational deviance encouraging illegal action. Points out that there's sometimes a myth of organizational life being rational, under control, when there's often a lot more chaos. Individuals don't set all policies. There's an ecology of an organization where policies appear, take on lives of their own, and encourage the kinds of organizational deviance Punch is worried about. And once those deviant or corporate norms take hold, individuals are pushed to conform. So, in this sense, organization is both the offender in corporate crime, but in some ways it's victim as well, as the whole organization is pushed in a direction. The organizational component is a defining characteristic of corporate crime. Without the organization, you don't have corporate crime. But there are also very deliberate conspiracies which are really conducted on behalf of the organization with the rational view of increasing profits and organizational success. That is a far more systematic deviance where there's these purposeful conspiracies. A corporate environment is often what he refers to as crime facilitative. You have a weak government enforcement, collusive behavior often between corporations and the regulators who are looking the other way, and it makes it seem rational and even reasonable to break the law. Often the issue is more, why would people take the irrational course of obeying the law? On the individual level, very few people go 55 when they see everybody else going 65 and 70. This is often what happens on a grander scale, and the effects can be deadly. And a lot of folks who might be highly moral in their day-to-day life go to work and absorb the corporate culture norms, and you see the results. There's also other corporate deviance that reflects internally destructive corporate deviance, ones that are harmful to the organization as well as to the outside society. You know, yeah, corporations sometimes are in a state of breakdown. You have factions, you have fiefdoms, you have dirty politics within corporate politics, and a lack of coherence. A lot of business school stories talk about success stories and building towards central control and a uniform corporate culture, but that's not always the reality. Many management ideas fail because of psychopathic bosses or bad incentives. You get authoritarian behavior from above, civility from below, and then lots of rule bending on the side that leads to an overall dysfunctional organization. That's where you end up with corporate crime as what is referred to as just system failure. Companies ceasing to function as they were meant to. The rule bending and breaking becomes a solution to a problem of that system failure. More crime is bred as more problems develop, and there's a mad scramble to keep the ship afloat. Let's talk about examples of system failure. Your readings talks about the banking house Barings, where a 24-year-old trader was given the authority and power to make bets and investments that destroyed the firm because of collective enabling of incredible risk-taking that there should have been controls in place to stop. Also talked about a train crash where deregulation combined with short-term profit taking led to a deadly crash. And then you have the mega frauds at companies like Enron and WorldCom, where global economic markets were threatened by their systematic rule breaking, and the bosses were often not even understanding fully what the tech whiz kids they had hired were doing. So what encourages systematic corporate deviance? The end product going to be, how might we stop it? Well, when regulators are largely co-opted by industry and there are revolving doors between firms and government, you're often going to end up with very little outside pressure for companies to toe the line and not go off the brink. Then you'll have bull markets, massive speculation, the lure of mega profits, creating the incentive to try to figure a way around the rules. You'll have histories of accountant firms colluding and covering up the actions of those they were supposed to be monitoring. And within the firm, you end up with groupthink, often mindless obedience to a corporate leadership that everybody says, well, if everybody says this is the way to go, that's the way they go. And you end up, and we'll see this later in the session when we talk about the financial crisis of a decade ago, where a complete cognitive dissonance gets created, where all the signs of risk are ignored. And you end up, in the case of the financial crisis, a level of corporate deviance and crime that nearly crashed the global economy. So that's why we need to think about this, not just individual acts, but how all those individual acts may add up to collective corporate liability.